Start.
Okay, so my name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to especially welcome you today here on 4th of July weekend. It was a year ago, actually last week, that Lyndon LaRouche began this dialogue process with Manhattan, and he very much insisted a year ago over some, shall we say, trepidation that we do a webcast dialogue with him on 4th of July weekend. And I was just thinking about that verse, which Lynn, I think, likes. For if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? He's always very certain. And we're certainly glad to be back talking to you with Lynn. We missed you. And if you'd like to say anything to us at the beginning to get us started, please go right ahead.
Okay, I shall do that. What we've done, we've moved the agenda a little bit in space, but we have not moved it, in other words, downward. We hope that what we're doing is we hope we are doing it upward as an upward operation, which does not have to be a downward operation.
Okay. In his usual trenchant style, he's begun the dialogue. So what we're going to do is start with our questions. I think everybody here pretty much knows there's a few people here who are here for the first time. So the way it goes is, if you have a question, you get in the queue here and make your question be short, and then there'll be a response, and if necessary, there can be a follow-up question. So let's go to our first question.
Hello there, Lynn. It's wonderful to see you in this venue. So, you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, terrific. We're all very excited about what's going on, not just, but as excited as people here are about our new office and the and the wonderful events that we had last week. This pales by comparison with the excitement about what you and Helga have just done in Europe. And the time is being spent going through the videos and the texts, the transcripts, and letting it sink in and discussing it with people. And I wanted to ask you in particular to comment on a remark that was attributed to you in one of the transcripts, because for me personally, it triggered in most powerfully the accomplishment that this captures after all as a lifetime of work, which is in the course of the questions and answers, you addressed the matter that economic progress cannot be measured. I hope I'm not misquoting you, but you brought up this question of measurement and how it's not appropriate to think of economic progress in terms of what people normally think of as measurement, and it just shocked me, and I've been discussing this with people and getting tremendously excited responses, because what it really shows is that the lack of this knowledge, specifically of the nonlinear, ironical meaning of creativity in human development, was something that nobody understood until you picked the fight around this question. And I think the strength that's being shown by the way this conference proceeded really is a reflection of the fact that there are now world leaders who it's finally sunk in that they don't have to pay any attention to the piles of statistical BS that's thrown at them, but that in fact creativity is not a statistic, but it is a force in the universe. And I wonder if you would comment on this.
Yes, what happened was that at the end of this series of developments of dates, going to the closing moment, I raised this question particularly because I emphasize that you cannot possibly really accomplish what you should be looking to accomplish unless you understand what the principle is. You've got to come in with the principle. Don't just give them an explanation. Give them a principle which moves them. What we had is we had two people were involved crucially. They were both members of on record of the business end of the economy. And that worked. What happened is the whole audience that had been in there changed its composition from an indifferent response, not a hasty or one, but he just did it. And everybody was then, at the end of this little short exchange, they all, in the majority, said yes. And everything else dropped out. And that's what works. You've got to go out, you've got to present the idea, which is important to the people, which is within their comprehension. And you'll find that you can produce a movement within movements of people in political organization.
It's really extraordinary. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Lynn. I'm Al Corby. I'm a World War II veteran here with my buddy Bill Monroe. We both helped to win World War II. But today I have a question about the Tony Blair speech in Manhattan at the YMCA. Now, that's the Young Men's Christian Association. And I'm wondering if those words have any association with Tony Blair. He represents an empire that believes that the world's overpopulated, that 7 million is too many. We should be down to, rather, 7 billion is too many. We should be down to 1 billion. And the best way to accomplish this is with war, famine, and disease. And they're trying to do that right now. So I'm just wondering if the officials at that Young Men's Christian Association are aware of who he is, and also that he's associated with people in our own government who are kind of creeping, crawling tools that are working with that empire.
Well, I would say that from a standpoint of resonance, that what you would argue for can be delivered. It is potentially delivered. What happened is the British system, as such, took a blow, a real blow. That is not the end of the matter, but it was a blow. And now in Britain, there are some more people who are thinking in those directions. How it's going to go out, we don't know. But we know there's a shift in the process. We know that the cause has been motivated. And that's the best shot you can get in many things in life.
Right, good. Next.
Hi, Lynn, it's Alvin, and good to be with you again. So last week was a pretty intense week for the organization as a whole, between events in Europe and Texas and in New York. I've seen a small portion that was released on the site with some of the, for lack of a better term, highlights of some of the speakers and things that were involved. And you've said for a long time that, or you've been saying over the recent period, how the shift in the United States would be influenced by activities abroad, as typified by Xi Jinping and Putin. And so this echo seemed to be, from the few portions that I saw of this that were made available, that you're getting a cry of that there's a limit to the tyrant's power. And so some real, it appears to me, significant things took place, both in the numeric participation and at the level in which this was done. I have not seen the event in Texas or any reports on that, so I won't comment on that, though I'm feeling more and more familiar with the work and leadership that Keisha's providing in down there. Now, back here in New York, we had this weekend of our meetings on Saturday and then the concert. And my impression of the meeting, of the concert, was different than anything we've done so far. And it left me, if you asked me afterwards what happened, I would not have been able to tell you, really report what happened. I wasn't quite sure because this was all done while there was more history and background presented. This was really all done without words. Particularly the second part of the program where the Robert Hayes spirituals were introduced through his own words, providing the setting and his ideas for structuring what he did, and then following with presentations. So this was a discovery because I had no idea that any of this existed in American culture or in American history. And so we now have, little did I know, we have the resources now available to us to bring to our population to help them break the mental chains that exist. So this was not a feel-good event at all, yet I feel it was the deepest and most meaningful one that I've participated in yet. And that's simply what I wanted to share with you, and I'd like to hear your comments to that.
My only answer I can give to that under these circumstances, so that is in what you have experienced in the process of this matter, and so forth, I can say, yeah, you have done something. You have participated in moving something which is important, and as something which is important in the sense that we know it can roll on, and we can, or make it roll on. I think what you're doing is can have a real significant, very significant effect on what's going on in the population in Manhattan, for example.
Well, the other thing was that while I say that if you asked me Sunday night what went on, I couldn't have really given you a response. The carryover, without it being conscious, in discussions I'm having with contacts, has taken it to another level. Just in terms of being able to present the ideas in a more poetic form, where people, also I think the current global situation has people finding themselves with less and less places to hide, more intelligent people. So the same ideas that they might not have been open to, somehow now, with the way I'm approaching them, there seems to be somewhat of a shift, nothing titanic. So that was the best that I could report and the best that I could say I feel good about.
I would just add to this that what we had in the close of the meeting conference in Germany, that the whole population, not every person in the population, but the whole population changed its attitude on the relevant subject and became the majority. And the people who otherwise had been opposing this were just left in the side. So in Germany itself, this kind of effect worked. It worked in Germany, of course, but it worked with some of the people who work with us in terms of Germany. And this is a booster for not only for us is the organization, but you have to realize that when the German population or elements of the German population find themselves inclined to change their attitudes in a positive way. Now, there was a major concert which was produced in that same period of date, and that was brilliant. It was brilliant. It had, you get reactions from that still today. So what you do is you move the process, try to get some ahead, get the process ahead, and then try to do something better. And something better will then do something really better for you. And I think that's the way I look at it.
Thank you.
Very good.
Hi, Len. This is Christine from Montreal. My question is going to be on our concept of time, and especially for myself. I've been down here 3 times now since December, and every time I come down, it feels like half a year has passed, and it's only been like 2 months or even less sometimes. And it gets me to think about what really is our concept of time, and how are we, kind of orienting our boundary conditions as a result of that, as in how do we think something, how are we looking at possibilities within a time frame, for instance. And it made me think of something I read in Leibniz's Discourse on Metaphysics, where he brought up the point that God knew everything that was going to happen to Alexander the Great before it happened, yet we're also supposed to have free will. So you would think this is a bit of a paradox. How is that occurring unless our concept of time is wrong, and how we're thinking about the past, present, and future is compartmentalized, and we have to kind of get rid of that way of thinking about it. So right now we're in a historical moment in time where you have Putin, Xi Jinping, yourself, who are accomplishing things that people would have thought were impossible. And the Berlin Conference is an example of this as well. How would you, I guess, answer this for people who often say, there's not enough time, or things won't change based on their understanding of, we have this deadline or whatever. They just set a boundary condition on themselves, whereas you have lived, you could say, more than one life.
Yeah.
I'll leave that for you to advance.
Go ahead.
What?
Continue.
Oh, no, well, I'm just saying, because people are having problems thinking about what is possible based on that erroneous standpoint of how does time function. So I think you're the best person to ask this question, because you've lived many lifetimes. How would you answer this question?
No, the point is that the most important and significant thing in the experience of mankind is even a simple person in the course of life who becomes capable of making a great discovery, or a relatively great discovery, for mankind of that time. And that is that kind of achievement where somebody is inspired within themselves and what forces around them. They are the ones who motivate the kind of creativity which brings genius within a modest kind of market. That's it. You do the job. You have to realize that, what's important about a human being. A human being is a human being, but a human being can be more than just a simple human being. The human being can be one who motivates the discovery of something which is more powerful than they themselves had understood. And that's the history of mankind. That mankind, great minds, important people who move the world. These people, they are the ones who make the history. It may be a child who's educated, is brilliant. That brilliant child, more brilliant than anyone in the school system, more brilliant than anyone in the educational system as such. That kind of person, that kind of personality can create a giant step for all mankind. And that has been done. For example, Einstein. Einstein is an example of that kind of a model. And that's what you want.
And yourself. And yourself. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Lynn. It's Bruce from New Jersey. Given the holiday weekend now where we're celebrating American independence, I thought maybe you could give us some insight into the events going on, both what just happened in Germany, but also looking back a couple of days, I was reading the inaugural speech of the now president of the Philippines, where he was using the image of FDR and Lincoln and clearly identifying a shift that was now going on, not just within the Philippines, but elsewhere, and how that is going to affect things probably in the very short period for Obama.
Well, as you know, there are problems inside the Philippines in terms of political matters. But there are a few people who are in the field who are influential, and they do tend to provide a creation of a new advantage, which also is very much needed in terms of the Philippines. And that's the way we have to look at it. If you can, in your own self, in your own active in life, if you can make the movement move in a good direction, you've made a great contribution to the future of mankind. Without that, mankind may lose ever gained.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Daniel?
Hi, Lynn. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, good. This is Daniel. I just want to sort of think ahead, because watching what you accomplished with Helga and many collaborators in Germany, the first thought is the urgency that we do something here to match and exceed the quality of what was accomplished. And we are today, I think, 70 days away from the 15th anniversary of September 11th. We are, about a week from the NATO summit that will take place in Poland. And then, of course, the Congress is going to be out of session for most of July and all of August, and we have the likelihood of an increase of certain chaotic war drive kind of activities, as we have often seen at this kind of time. So, in the meanwhile, as you emphasized earlier this week, the leaders, the so-called leaders of Europe and the United States, are total frauds. They're completely discredited, and they're even admitting, as in the case of the IMF, that the system is bankrupt. I believe that Deutsche Bank is holding around $70 trillion of derivatives, which is the equivalent of the world GDP. So it's a ridiculous idea. So my question is, with this collapse of the so-called leadership and this very dangerous couple of months ahead, what should we do to advance our efforts here?
Well, in particular, what we have is we have the ability to follow what a great man did in dividing a new idea of mankind. And we have brought together in that area of southern Texas area. We put in something which is igniting a growth, a development within the organization of the United States right now. This thing is crucial. You know, that is the idea which was almost lost years ago. It's now come back. It's been brought back. And this kind of creativity, the creativity of the mankind intrinsically, that's what we depend upon, and that's what I think you want to depend upon too. It's just exactly that. We can go back into southern Texas, the Texas area. We've got a whole team which we've assembled there. It's a small team in one sense, but it's an excellent team. It's spreading out. It's working from Texas of all places. This is something very important. When Texas does something good, you have to cheer a great deal. But that movement we have in the various locations inside the United States is being mobilized still, and will be more and more active over the course of the immediate period, as I can estimate it. And so the point is just enjoy it. Enjoy the ride. It's the mission. It's not the ride. It really is the mission.
Thank you, Lynn. That's very helpful.
Brad, come on.
Good day, Mr. LaRouche. My name is Clive. I'm from the Caribbean country of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and it's a pleasure to be asking your question today. As a consequence of Brexit, what, in your opinion, would be the nature of the future prospects, the nature of the future relationships between the ACP countries and the EU on one hand, and the ACP countries and the New Britain on the other hand? Would either both improve or deteriorate vis-a-vis the economic development of these countries, and what would you advise them to do?
Well, I would say things like China. The movement of China is one of the greatest things that's happening to the world as a whole right now. The development, the self-development of China, and the influence of China's own development within its own reigns. This is one of the most brilliant and satisfying experiences that mankind has ever had so far. That's what we've got it. So we may be looking for other things and other options which are also useful and necessary. But when you get your eye on this achievement, this kind of achievement, you have made it a real achievement.
Thank you.
Ah, young lady.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you clearly.
Great.
Across the waters.
All right. Good afternoon. This is Jessica White from Brooklyn. And I just wanted to give a brief report of something that took place this week that you probably heard about, but I don't know if everybody in the room heard about this intervention. On Tuesday, while nations who understand what we're facing, what a terrible situation we're in, and what we're facing as far as war and the collapse of the economy are concerned, we're having a conference with you and Helga and other nations present. Tony Blair came to visit New York City. And this was, in my opinion, a way to offset the good that was going on in Germany and try to get the people of New York to play into or buy into the British thing, you know. He was talking about the vote that took place. He was being his charming, deadly self. And, you know, people were really falling for it. And the thing that was interesting about it is that I was called, school is over, by the way, and this was the last day of school, and I was cleaning and doing all kinds of things at school, and I was called and asked to go to this. So, of course, I thought about what you said about looking inside yourself and doing what you need to do, finding things that you know you can do to make this better, to go out and educate people as to what's really going on in the world. So I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go. And you needed a ticket to get into this event. Now, I didn't have a ticket. Daniel had already been inside, had gotten inside, and had made a brilliant intervention into this whole thing with Tony Blair. Called him a liar, told him he was a murderer, talked about real things that had happened in Europe and in England and other areas of the world because of the British Empire policy. And I had missed that. I wasn't there for that. In the meantime, I was trying to get a ticket. So I go to the box office, and I say to a very nice African-American young lady standing behind the counter, I said, well, how much is this ticket? And she said, well, how much, you know, you want to get into the event? And I said, yes, I do. So, you know, how much is the ticket? And I was kind of like, uh-oh. So she said, here's a ticket. And she gave me a ticket to get inside. And not only did she do that, she went to the usher that was at the door and said, she's a little late, they've already started, can she come in this way? And he said, fine. It was a balcony ticket, so I went up to the balcony. Now, just a little aside, this kind of stuff happens to me a lot. You know, I was tickled inside to think that this young lady had given me a ticket, and she didn't know who I was, but she just liked me. So, so I get inside, and Tony Blair is talking, and like I said, very charming little jokes, talking about all the things that have taken place that Britain has done right in the world, and how they have interventions in Africa, and they're doing all these wonderful things for people. And towards the end, I said, oh, excuse me, why all the questions seem to be pre-screened? There were no questions from the audience. And the people who are really dumb, they started booing and saying, oh, sit down and stuff. So I said, no, the person who is on the stage right now, Tony Blair, sir, you are a liar. And you represent and are a willing accomplice to the genocidal policy of population reduction. And at that point, I was surrounded by 5 security people. And they said, miss, because they were trying to still be nice, could you get your things, you have to leave? And I said, well, wait a minute, I got to get my stuff. And they said, well, get your stuff, you have to go. And so I said, well, wait a minute, I got to get my umbrella. And they said, well, get your umbrella. So I got tossed out. And on the way out, I said, I've been thrown out of better places than this. And that is my report. I heard later that Daniel did give a report about this event, and that we were successful in intervening in this the rat Tony Blair, in his whatever presentation or whatever you want to call it. And I'd like you to comment, because the people in the audience, I know here, many are my friends and colleagues, and I want to make it clear that these are not always easy things to do, but it's something that you have to think about what you can do to further our cause and to make it known to other people, even if they don't realize that they're being sabotaged and duped. You still have to tell the truth at all times. And this is what we're all about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Hello, Lyndon.
How do you do?
Well,
As if I didn't know.
so I have a bit of an initial report on some aspects of the Manhattan Project, but I want to do it backwards in time. I think the effect that our music concert had here on Sunday was heightened by the fact that we were doing it on the same weekend that we had the conference in Germany and the musical presentation in Germany. There was a resonance, a confluence. Adding to that, we had certain representatives there that are directly related to the tradition in American history of Roland Hayes, William Warfield, Sylvia Oden Lee, an extremely strong tradition in the past century. But I want to say something about a discussion that we had with one of the principals at the concert, Elvira Green, who worked closely with Roland Hayes, Sylvia, Warfield. We had a discussion with her on Monday after the conference, some of the singers. And she said two things that stuck out to me. So I want to refer to those things and then go back to the concert. She said to us, you're dealing with a challenge. Any performer, artist, is dealing with a challenge. And she said some of us had a specific challenge because we were both performers and audience members. And that was something that was extremely important. And she questioned each of us on what we thought about that. What did we think about the performance? She said there's performance and informance. She said the artist, the singer, the speaker, the politician, has to be extremely sensitive of the effect that they're trying to have on the audience. They have to know exactly what the effect is that they're trying to have on the audience. And this came up in an interesting way because we had some clapping in the middle of some pieces that were more intense. And the idea of educating the audience was what came to the fore. And she said, look, you don't always have time to educate the audience before the performance. It may be their first performance. You may not have seen them before. So you have to educate them as you're performing, which I thought was an extremely powerful idea. So now I'll go back to Sunday. The response that we're getting at all of these concerts, because we have them about once every 2 weeks, it's not a response to good music. It has nothing to do with good music or nice sounding music. People are responding to the fact that we are doing something necessary. You said a couple weeks ago, what's the value of a human life? How do you think about human life? You said the individual has to live a life that was necessary, not just good. And what we did with this past concert, in concert with what happened in Germany, the response from the audience was a recognition that they were experiencing something that was necessary. And specifically, because they got something that was a representation, a creative representation of a way out of the crisis that they all know they're embroiled in. So this is my sort of report with not as many details as I thought it was going to be. But I think the Manhattan Project is now in the middle of a heightened offensive in this direction, specifically for that reason. Anyway, that's all I have to say right now.
You know, I can follow this action that you've been participating in over the period of time, and I think that everything that you have said about this is quite more than adequate in terms of defining what the issue is. In other words, what your devotion must be to achieve something that you have not yet achieved, but you are determined to achieve. And that's very good. That's very strong.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, good. Hi. I actually, well, I hate to, this is somewhat lower level, I'm afraid, because I have observed the last couple of days the New York Times is doing a really disgusting promotion of President Barack Obama, trying to make him look human, which he is not. And I think I think they're very desperate because of what's happening, what we saw expressed in Germany. But as you know, they released the report. Obama has released the report on the number of civilians, the alleged number of civilians that he's killed with his drone strikes, excepting it does not include Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. And he claims it's only between 64 and 116 people, and that he has killed 2,500 people who supposedly are terrorists. And of course, none of this information or evidence on any of this has been provided to any court of law or anything else. So that was the first one. And then today, just as we were starting this meeting, they've produced another very desperate puff piece, because we know, you've described it, the images of him playing basketball in his jockstrap and things like that in his spare time. But they try to pretend that he stays up hours at night. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he is sending very important messages from his BlackBerry phone about, you know, responding to Donald Trump's comments on Orlando and so on. Now, I mean, besides the fact that this is gross and not convincing, I do think there's an element of desperation, and partly because clearly what we saw reflected in Germany is that a lot of people are catching on to the fact that Obama, on behalf of the British Empire, is really trying to push a war with Russia. That you saw this in Canada, that he went up there and tried to get them to send troops to join the NATO deployment on Russia's borders. And Finland is under intense pressure to join NATO, etc. So, at any rate, I just would like to get your thoughts on this. Is there a relationship between these things? And what do you think otherwise about the strategic situation?
Well, you know, I'm completely convinced, of course. I have been convinced, and I'm aware of what you're doing. I haven't got every detail of what you've been doing, but what you've been doing, this is what is necessary. This is the necessary mission. It has many different kinds of other expressions, but they all amount to the same thing. And I think this function is extremely important. Without it, I think there would be less of a chance of mankind's coming out of this thing alive.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Lynn.
Yes.
Happy Independence.
Healthier now, right?
What's that?
You're healthier now, I understand.
Yeah. Otherwise, I wouldn't be speaking to you.
I know. I appreciate that greatly.
Yeah, I want to raise two things or get your thinking. Helga made the point after the conference. As I heard the report, she said that the conference constituted a revolution in Germany. Now, you alluded to this a bit a few minutes ago, I think. But I would ask you to elaborate if you would. You emphasized at the end of the conference Steinmeier's unique role. You had Yakunin, who was scheduled to speak, did not speak, came to Berlin under attack, created the Dialogue of Civilizations organization. Kuyat was there. I mean, this is very rich. So if there's, under these immediate strategic circumstances, so anything you could elaborate on revolution in Germany? That was the first. Why don't I ask you to elaborate, and I'll come to the second.
Well, first of all, there was a great assembly that occurred in the context of that expression, that movement. And it was a very large thing. It was very successful, extremely successful. And it was done in a cathedral. It was based on a cathedral process. So we came out of that thing, we were all more or less just overjoyed, because the final result of this part of the long presentation, this was a beautiful thing, an absolutely beautiful thing when it was finished. And we were all really happy about it. And this is the kind of thing which happened in Germany, and right in the sense of the organization there. And these kinds of things, when they happen under those kinds of circumstances, you have to recognize them, and you have to recognize that what you're experiencing is their own, each of them, their own effort to make something meaningful, more meaningful, of their lives and the lives of the children around them. The children as such in this event, this kind of thing. This was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And these kinds of things do happen. They happen also in Germany, and this is a good example of it.
Let me, in terms of the second thought, pick up really on the question Daniel was getting at about what lies ahead for us here, how we advance the work here. But let me situate it in the occasion, which is that we have July 4, we have Independence Day. In a certain sense, I would be interested if there's a kind of Independence Day message to America. That is, if you take your concept of necessary predecessor, necessary successor, and you situate what Franklin and Hamilton and so on did in 1776, 1789, from the standpoint of Leibniz's conceptions, Leibniz's creation of physical economy, Leibniz's notion of pursuit of happiness, as it's famously incorporated in the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton is developing an economic science building upon Leibniz. You have done that. You have done that beyond, as the necessary successor, beyond anyone in history. The question of reestablishing the independence of the American Republic, of securing the Republic. Franklin was asked in Philadelphia, what kind of nation have you given us? A republic if you can keep it. Yeah. And we've done a damn lousy job of keeping it for a long time. But the challenge to us, as the leadership of the nation, is the process by which to reestablish that republic, is building on Leibniz, building on Hamilton. That, it seems to me, is what this conference represented universally, but also to bring it back into the immediate challenge in the United States. So if you have anything on that.
I do have. There were some things that are disappointing that happened in the assembly, as formal assembly, but there was no great harm done, to my knowledge. But I think the notable thing was a coincidence, because the cathedral, of this cathedral, right there in that location, this thing drew people from all over the area, not just in Germany. And this thing ended up with a real celebration, a celebration which could not be denied, a beautiful celebration. And Helga and I and others there, and they were doing all kinds of wonderful things that musicians can do, and they did it. So that the ability to generate or to participate in generating an experience, an emotional experience, an intellectual experience, which says the world still has something beautiful in it, and it's growing right now. And that's what was happening. And I think you can probably get a report of this formally on the exact dates of where this occurred, and what the celebration was, particularly the concluding part, The concluding part was really exuberant. So grab it, grab the facts. I'm sure you can get the things traced back into some of the people. But these were people that came from all parts of the United States and elsewhere. Not all of them, but all of them. And we had people, I was sitting next to a person with Helga, was sitting to a person next to me. He was from the middle of the period. And others, we had, the particular music really worked. So this thing was something that really worked. That the majority of the people coming out of the cathedral, it's a very large cathedral there, and this thing was exuberance itself, by and large. And it came from Germans, but not only Germans, a lot of people came there to join with the Germans, and it was a beautiful job. So this, I think an example like that is the kind of thing you can seize upon as something to grab. Say, this happened. This has affected the people of that population. This thing was it's a giant cathedral. And so that's what happened. And I think that's something which Helga and I, in particular, shared in the experience of going through the processes of this event. It was beautiful.
I get your emphasis. Thank you.
Rob? Okay, go ahead. Yeah. This is Rob from Staten Island. And this is something I've probably asked before, but what can we really do to reverse the perpetual war drive and constant buildup of the military budget, and how that has such a negative effect on the rest of the economy?
Yeah, well, the point is, what are you looking for? Mankind is looking for the future of mankind, not for the future of the person merely as such, but for something which can be rejuvenated as a creativity, a forced process of creativity, which develops a population or parts of a population to a higher level of appreciation of what mankind is, to understand what the obligations of mankind are to as such. Like Einstein. I mean, the example which I find most familiar to me is Einstein. Einstein was a genius, a true genius. He was a genius beyond all geniuses of my time. And he's still, in a sense, while deceased, is still doing that by the influence he's exerting in terms of his, now a whole generation beyond. So that's the kind of thing. Where mankind can contribute something, and especially things like what Einstein has done with his life over a span of a century now, recently. And this is the kind of thing which should be prized above all kinds of common things.
Hi, Mr. LaRouche. My name is Victor Herrera. I'm new to this. I'm a New York City resident, also a Florida resident. But as I'm hearing everybody present all these questions to you, I'm pretty interested in the thing in regards to all the disasters or tragedies that we faced in the past 20 years regarding Oklahoma, Sandy Hook, the recent one, Orlando, including 9/11. In Orlando, I suffered a loss in the attack. One of my cousins was killed there. Even with all these disasters or tragedies that we faced, the question still remains to me that I'm going to ask you: do you believe that in order to avoid war, we have to prepare for it?
I think that's a bad idea. That is to make characterizations like that. It's a bad idea. Wars have happened. Some wars were necessary in their context. All kinds of things. So the question is not what you have done or will have done as such. The important thing is what will your life have done for the successive parts of the population now. It's what can you infuse in the people around you who are facing life or continuation of life. Are you capable of finding in yourself something which is called creativity, and to, by that means, enable a large number of people in the United States and beyond to become something of a genius? I think that's the thing you want to look for.
Thank you. Okay, so that is a summary of our questions for this week, Lynn. Just one thing I'd like you to know, our Manhattan Project, with respect to 9/11 and the process that we have been discussing concerning our chorus and the Mozart Requiem, that is in place. And the process will begin to develop over the course of the next several weeks. And this dialogue is going to punctuate and, shall we say, catalyze that each time. So we have a pulse into that process. The thing I'd like you to comment on that I was thinking about from when you first started talking and you described in response to Alvin, the process in Germany in the audience as you talked, and then people converged upon this idea of principle. That's something I have seen you do for 40 years from the first meetings I came to. And the character, the physical feeling was you'd be there and things would clear up. That's kind of the way it would be. And then a week or so would go by. This is when you were doing the weekly classes. And for a couple of days, 3, 4, 5 days, you still pretty much felt the same way. And then around about day 5 or 6, you felt like you were sinking. And you would come back to these meetings, and then you'd feel like, oh, wait a minute, hey, you're back up there again. And it's sort of like swimming, where you're sort of going for a while, and then, you sink down. Now, clearly, this idea that you put forward about principle, that's different than pluralism, than issue orientation, than hot button, all that stuff, which we've pretty much, increasingly, as you can see from the questions, increasingly begun to eliminate from the discussions, or the thinking anyway. So I'd just like to ask you to say something, if you would, if you have more, about why you can do that and why everybody else who wishes to can learn how to do that.
Well, the point is you realize that there's something wrong. There's a vacancy in the behavior of a society. And you look for those kinds of things and you say, well, I've got to do something about these things. People may be doing good work, may have good ideas, may have a view outlook, shall we say. But the question is, you cannot overdo that, not in the right way. If you can do something better, do it. No matter how good what you're already doing. If you can do something better, do it.
Okay. I think that's a good place to conclude. Thank you.